Hey, this is Dodecadendron here, and today we're going to be talking about the invisible condition. That's right. It's the only besides in rare cases deafened and prone, the only one of the only real beneficial conditions. And this way, invisible is almost the opposite to blindness, because with blindness, you basically don't know where the enemies are, but if there is one in your space, they say they attack you with 5 feet. It's obvious. You can attack back. That's basically the same for invisible, except the other way around. You're basically imposing limited blindness on your enemies because they have disadvantage against you and you have advantage against them. So an invisible creature is impossible to see without the aid of magic, or some special sense like blind sight for the purpose of hiding. For the purpose of hiding, this creature is heavily obscured. The creature's location can be detected by any noise it makes or tracks it leaves. Attacks against that creature have disadvantage and has advantage on all of its attacks. Spells that grant invisibility include invisibility, greater invisibility, sequester, and mislead. There are other ways to gain this benefit, such as the Gloomstalker Ranger being invisible to any creature that relies on dark vision to see in darkness, the Archfey's Misty Escape ability, the Trickster Cleric's Cloak of Shadows Channel Divinity, the Monk's Empty Body, the Shadow Monk's Cloak of Shadows, among others, including the Tasha's Cauldron of Everything new Ranger ability, which as a bonus action, you can become invisible. Previously it was only a +10 to stealth. There are racial traits like the Furbolg, which get invisibility, and enemies like the Durgar, Imp, Quasit, Fairy Dragon, Invisible Stalker, Green Hag, and a ton of others, especially like some that just get invisibility as a spell. It is actually relatively rare amongst enemies, and there are many ways to become aware of invisible creatures, such as the Ranger's Feral Senses, the Rogue's Blind Sense, the Transmuter's Stone ability. Those with Blind Sight, Tremor Sense, or True Sight can see them. Fairy Fighter also reveals the location of invisible creatures. Creatures like Koatoa can sense invisible creatures. One benefit of being invisible is that you can hide pretty much anywhere you want. Again, you don't need to hide necessarily as an invisible creature because you're already getting advantage on your attacks, whereas, hidden automatically gives you advantage, but you don't need that. It's just if you want your enemies not to be able to see where you are. So that's one thing. Additionally, if you have detect magic, there should be like a illusion, or at least most spells like grant invisibility are illusion or around them, so you can find them that way. Despite this, you're still gonna have the benefits of invisibility. Even if they spot you, you can basically they still have disadvantage against you, and you still have advantage on attacks, which is still pretty powerful. Something like invisibility coupled with deafening the opponents can make it even harder for them to spot you, because normally the only signifier would be if they attack, cast a spell, or whatnot. But if you're casting spells that aren't obvious and they're just verbal components, you can basically get away with doing whatever you want, not being noticed. In my opinion, I would say it varies based off of whether your position can be known based off how chaotic the battlefield is. If you're like in an empty room with a bunch of adventurers, you're going to be spot pretty easily because they're going to be able to notice your every motion. If you're one in 10 enemies, in 10 people that the enemies are fighting, then they're not going to pay as much attention to you. One or two may be able to detect their positions, but not all of them. Ranged attacks can be especially deadly with invisibility, because it's a lot harder to detect where they are, because even if you fire an arrow, you can just move location and they're never going to be able to know. I would allow for creative ways of revealing the enemy, such as throwing sand on them. Not sure about blood though, because this is technically part of them still, but at least not their own blood. Sand, or if you're in a muddy place, they might leave footsteps. things like that. But remember, all these the opponents can do too. Also, I would say that you might be able to vaguely be able to see them in fog, like as if they were one obscurity heavier than they are in whatever they're in. Um, but it's like there's a ruffle in the bushes if they're not careful or whatnot. So, your enemies and you can both use these to try to counter invisibility. Again, like I mentioned in my stealth video, stealth in D&D is pretty vague and quite annoying. Because it's like, oh, does this, count as, is this place count as me being able to hide? Am I able to move out of this while invisible without people noticing? Like I mentioned earlier, there's, a lot of ways you can kind of figure this out with, is there location, is there footprints? But it's not always obvious. It depends on how much your DM has an idea of the setting around you, and so on and so forth. Again, both sides be careful, because what I found is that like hiding and stealth enemies can be incredibly annoying to fight against and not enjoyable. So my recommendation would be to keep that in mind. Like make a way to counter it, or like I would say there's a middle ground, right? Maybe have them invisible earlier so that like it can't be counterspelled immediately, because that always sucks. But there's ways to get around it. Like there's if the allies are smart about it, there are notable things they can pick up on to find the invisible person's location, and their concentration DC isn't too high, and things like that. One of the best places to use stealth is actually outside of combat, because it lasts for an hour. The second level invisibility spell, right? And if you upcast it, it affects more people, which means it's easy to make a whole party invisible. And once your whole party is invisible, you have advantage on stealth checks. If someone else adds in like hide in plain sight, that's even harder to find you all. So you can infiltrate areas, get information as if they couldn't see you there. There are a ton of ways to use this in creative ways that a lot of other things can't. Like Charmed, again, is one of the only ones that really works outside of combat in terms of conditions, but invisibility is another example of something that can be used outside of combat and has a ton of creative implications. The blinded video, invisibility has a huge advantage where a lot of spells say that must target a creature you can see. There's a lot of fun things you can do to prevent or annoying, depending if you're a caster or not, to prevent seeing spells from working. Like if you're engulfed by a creature, there are a lot of spells that don't basically can't save that person within the engulfed creature, which is frustrating. And as a scary component, like I don't see that as a used often, but it's a very scary way to trap your players. Like one of the only spells that doesn't do that is sleep. So one time I used that and just had to pray that my companion had more HP than the creature outside of him. But there's just a lot of things you can do. There's a ton of spell effects you can just avoid while invisible, which is nice if you're going up against spellcasters, because it's sort of an offset, right? Because as a caster, you have a lot of access to get around invisibility that you normally can't. You have AoE, you have you can basically just ignore attack rolls entirely, but this is a nice offset to that. There's this really weird interaction where Mind Blank clouds anyone attempting to locate your presence with a divination spell, which means that if you Mind Blank yourself while invisible, True Sight doesn't work on you, which means you stay invisible. Again, like you can bypass see invisibility with Mind Blank. Mind Blank plus invisibility is such a crazy combo. And again, while Mind Blank is a high level spell, a lot of 8th levels fall flat. Interestingly enough, invisibility is fairly cheap with abilities and spells, but expensive with items, almost all invisibility items are attunement, and they still have the qualifier that you become revealed afterwards. Like, it's basically like a legendary item if you want to stay invisible without being seen, which I guess makes sense, and has some allusion to Lord of the Rings, right? Again, you don't have to use invisibility on yourselves. Well, that's the most obvious use. If you're kidnapping someone, you can actually turn them invisible, and it'll be like no one's gone. I love the ability that the Mystic had when that was still a thing. The psionic talent that basically made you invisible to one creature, which could make it feel like people are going insane. Just like fun stuff like that you can do with invisibility that you can't normally can, is just really fun. That was invisibility. Now, you have fun using these in your game, and make sure to think about the creative implements. I'm sure you have some of your own. Until next time, this is Dodecadentian, signing out.